Good evening. I'm Greg Smith, President of Westwood Kehilla. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this very special program, brought to you through the magic of live streaming, as we honor Yossi Klein Halevi with our 2022 International Visionary Award, and Clark and Wendy Gross with our 2022 Community Visionary Award. I believe you will find Mr. Halevi's keynote address both informative and challenging. First, a word about Westwood Kehilla. We are a dynamic and diverse modern Orthodox synagogue located in Westwood and serving West Los Angeles. Our members include Jews of all flavors, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and a wide range of philosophical and religious outlooks. Our goal is to provide a welcoming home to Jews along a wide spectrum of knowledge and belief and religious practice. To those from families whose commitment to Judaism goes back many generations, to those who are simply beginning to explore. We are committed to knowing about the wider world as well. Our synagogue has welcomed a very wide range of speakers, not only rabbis, but a wide variety of others, including political and Muslim speakers, Israeli speakers, even a reformed gangster. While our home is in Westwood, our commitment is not only to our local community, but to the wider community as well. Each year, we demonstrate that focus and that commitment by recognizing and honoring a visionary who has made a difference on the local or the national or the international stage. We call our award a Visionary Award, and we present it at a banquet. And so tonight, we recognize three visionaries: Clark and Wendy Gross, who had a vision of what Westwood Kehilla could be and have spent years making it happen. And to Yossi Klein Halevi, an internationally acclaimed author and public intellectual, a well-known speaker and writer on issues of concern to the Jewish and Israeli communities, a kind and honest intellectual who has wrestled with the place of Jews in both Israel and the diaspora. To Yossi, we will be awarding our 2022 International Visionary Award. We'll be privileged to hear Yossi give the keynote address tonight on the topic of this Jewish moment. And I assure you that you will find his talk challenging, enlightening, and very thought-provoking. It's now my pleasure to introduce Westwood Kehilla Rabbi, Avi Stewart. Rabbi Stewart's scholarship and warmth have been hallmarks of his leadership since becoming Westwood Kehilla's rabbi 10 years ago. Rabbi Stewart is not only the educational and spiritual leader of Westwood Kehilla, but also literally the voice of Westwood Kehilla. A concert-level vocalist who's been chosen to sing the Star-Spangled Banner at Dodger Stadium, Rabbi Stewart, along with accompanist and duet partner Ari Goldwag, will provide musical interludes throughout tonight's program. It's my pleasure to bring you the very wonderful Rabbi Avi Stewart.
Clark and Wendy are really and truly deserving of this award, and I'm so privileged to have known them for the past 9+ years. So thrilled that they're part of our community, whether it's minyanim, whether it's being on the board, whether it's being involved with Kiddush, you name it. Clark and Wendy have been super helpful assets to our community, and their making Aliyah truly is a loss for us. On the one hand. On the other hand, aren't we all happy for them? They're so fortunate, they're so lucky they get to move to Eretz Yisrael, live in Eretz Yisrael, make Aliyah, And my bracha for us is that we all be zocha, that we all merit our own spiritual and physical aliyot. Clark and Wendy, we can't wait to see you in Israel. We hope to not just come visit, but come live even as soon as we possibly can. Hatzlacha and Mazel Tov. Clark and Wendy, thank you so much for being honored by the Westwood Kehilla. You've been a part of the Westwood Kehilla for more than 20 years. Been a part of my life for almost 10 years now, and it's been such a privilege and such a pleasure to call you dear friends of ours. And we wish you nothing but the best. We want you to have tremendous nachat from your entire family as you make this aliyah and you move up to Israel. It should be an aliyah that's not just one that's physical in terms of where you're moving places, but it's a spiritual aliyah. The Talmud tells us that Eretz Yisrael is Gavoa Mikol Ha'aratzot, that Israel is the highest of all places, the place where you can connect to Hashem in a way that you can't connect to Him outside of Eretz Yisrael. And we're so pleased and so happy for you and for your entire family. Our bracha to you is that Be'ezrat Hashem, you, both of you together with your children, with Elisheva, God willing she gets there sometime soon as well, and Sarah, and your son-in-law and the grandchildren, you should continue to see your family grow in every possible way, Be'ezrat Hashem, have tremendous nachat, and the aliyah should be one that is an aliyah for the entire family in every possible way. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. This song is composed by A.B. Rottenberg, and Shani rewrote the lyrics to match a theme that's very, very important to me, and that is the power of the individual. I often tell my students, sometimes my clients, that the most pathetic thing in the world is a Jew that has low self-esteem. How can you have low self-esteem? God created you, and you're a whole world into and of yourself. You're a whole world yourself. B'shvili nivra olam, the world was created for you, for me, each of us as individuals. And what you bring to the table, nobody else throughout history or in the future will ever bring to the table. And that power of the individual was really a bracha that was given to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham, our forefather. When God told him that your children will be like the stars. And that's the metaphor that we're going to sing about. In what way is a Jewish person like a star? The Baal Shem Tov teaches a very incredible, uplifting teaching that we're going to sing about right now.
A night dark and vast, heavens open wide. Vayetzer Zoi hachutza, he brought him outside. Al tira, don't fear, I'm always here. Habetna hashamayma, look up at the sky. The promise endures through millions of nights, illuminated by millions of lights. The legacy of a nation to be. Your children shine bright. Each lights up the world. Every star has a mission and name. The closer you get, the brighter they burn. And you realize no two are the same. He holds each one close, for each one is a world with a vision, a story, a dream. Precious forever, you are in his eyes. When emis bar lekaychavim. Now it's your job and mine to see every star. And if it's not shining, it means we're too far. It's our chance to begin. Find the glow that's within. As we become the galaxy that we truly are. To see others shine, there's one thing to do. Realize your own light that's deep within you. For that glow will reflect as you reach and connect. V'hemin b'Hashem, we believe that it's true. Sefoirach Chovim, each lights up the world. Every star has a mission and name. The closer you get, the brighter they burn. And you realize no two are the same. Oh, he holds each one close, for each one is a world, with a vision, a story, a dream. Precious forever, you are in his eyes. My name is Barlek Chavim. Oh, Yisforach Chavim. He lights up the world. Every star has a mission, a name. The closer you get, the brighter they burn. You realize no two are the same. Oh, he holds each one close, for each one is a world, with a vision, a story, a dream. Precious forever, you are in his eyes. My name is Barlek Chavim. My name is Barlek Chavim. My name is Barlek Chavim.
Again, a special thank you to Clark and Wendy Gross, our 2022 Community Visionary Award recipients, for their commitment, their energy, and their leadership at Westwood Kehilla. It's now my pleasure to introduce David Suissa, who, in turn, will introduce Yossi Klein Halevi. David is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles-based Jewish Journal. Under his leadership, the Jewish Journal has been recognized throughout America for the excellence of its commentary and content. Although the Jewish Journal brings us news of the Los Angeles Jewish community, its range and its scope is far, far more than that. With its focus on national and international news, the arts and writers of diverse and often competing views. For the last 2 years, Jewish Journal has been recognized by the American Jewish Press Association as the best Jewish newspaper in America. And David has been recognized by the Jewish Press Association for excellence in commentary. If you are not a regular reader of the Jewish Journal, you are missing out on a national treasure whose home is Los Angeles. It's now my great pleasure to present David Suissa.
My friend Greg Smith, Westwood Kehilla, asked me to introduce Yossi Klein Halevi at this great event for his congregation. And I have to say, the expression, "this man needs no introduction," I think was invented for Yossi. Instead of introducing him, I'd like to share a story of how I met him. I used to be an avid reader of Yossi's. In the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and major publication, I read his book, Confessions of a Jewish Extremist. Was a huge fan. I had an ad agency at the time, and the head of the New Republic came to the office. And one of the things I told him is, my God, I'm a huge fan of one of your writers. He said, who? He said, Yossi Klein Halevi. He said, you know, I can introduce you. And I said, it turns out I'm going to be in Israel next week. So that's where I met Yossi. I was expecting 2 hours of the most brilliant political analysis and conversations. You have to understand how big Yossi was then. He was the one we would all revere. Whenever there was a crisis, everybody would write, and then finally Yossi would come down from the mountaintop with the most brilliant analysis. So that's what I was expecting. A long, beautiful afternoon conversation in Jerusalem on all the political issues of the day. Instead, we spent the first hour talking about God. And I discovered a whole side to Yossi I had no idea existed. And we spoke about how he meditates every morning. We spoke about one of his great rabbi friends, Yoel Glick, who I came to know. And the reason I bring up this story is because it really helped me understand who this man was. And I realized then that what I loved about his political analysis was that there was a serenity to it. There was a depth. There was a soulfulness. And that soulfulness, I understood that day where it came from. And that was 22 years ago. And since then, we've become the closest of friends. And we've been through so many journeys together. I saw him when he came up with his book at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. How he spent a year with the 3 big religions, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Holy Land. And it was named by the LA Times as the best spiritual book of the decade. Of course, it came right when 9/11 hit. And then I saw him how for over 10 years, he struggled mightily to put his magnus opus, Like Dreamers, together. And I saw the struggle that he went through. And then recently, he wrote perhaps one of the most consequential books in America in the last 2 years, which was Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor, that has now become an incredible resource for so many organizations. And the second story I want to share with you is because I started writing at the same time that I met Yossi. And it was kind of weird in the beginning because I became friends with someone who I don't want to say worshipped, but someone who I incredibly admired. I was a big fan of his, and then we became close friends. And I remember one day I was driving him to the airport in LA, and I said, Yossi, I gotta ask you this, because your writing is so beautiful, and your thinking, and it's so lyrical. And at the time I was really struggling, and I still do. I was going through 20, 30 drafts of every column I wrote. And I said, how hard is it? How much do you struggle every time you write a column? And he turned to me and he said, David, you have no idea. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I struggle over every word. And I struggle over the cadence and the music of the sentences. And I told him later how important that was for me to hear this. That I'm not alone. And the greatness of his writing is something that is rooted in a tremendous amount of holy struggle. And I can tell you that the struggle that we're going through right now, the craziness and the madness and the incredible fears that we're going through, it's this bewildering time. As someone who's in the news business and who's used to 24-hour news cycle, and right now we're in the middle of a 22-month news cycle with COVID. There's never been a time when we need these kind of sane voices like Yossi's to help us make sense of this craziness. And I think the title of his talk tonight, The Jewish Moment, is perfect, because there's no one I know who can better understand the Jewish moment and the human moments that we all have to go through. So it's a tremendous privilege to introduce my very dear friend, Yossi Klein Halevi.
David, thank you so much for your warm introduction. There's really nobody I would rather share this moment with than with you. I've been, as you know, a fan of yours for so many years, and just want to thank you for your friendship, first of all, and for the extraordinary work you do for the Jewish people, and for putting out, by far, the best Jewish paper in America. And Andy and Greg, we've been friends now for almost 40 years. I'm deeply grateful for your friendship and for your love, which I reciprocate. And thank you all for this honor. And delighted to be with the Kehilla, and given the approach that you take to Jewish life, the way in which you embrace Jews across the spectrum, I'm especially honored to be with you. So, Rabbi Stewart, Clark and Wendy Gross, friends of the Kehilla. Like many of you, I grew up in a Jewish world that, in retrospect, seems very uncomplicated. I was son of a Holocaust survivor growing up in Brooklyn of the 1960s and 70s. And the Soviet Jewry cause was my framework for public Jewish expression. Israel in those years was fighting for its life in a way that was so obvious that it united the whole Jewish people. And growing up under the shadow of the Shoah, confronting the Soviet Union, confronting the Arab world's war against Israel's existence, in some way made it easy for my generation. The moral complications the moral considerations were pretty straightforward. We were unequivocally right, the Jewish people was united, and we were facing unequivocal evil. And sometimes I feel a certain nostalgia for the clarity of those moments, of that time, because the truth is we live today in a very different time. We live today in a Jewish reality, both in Israel and in America, of complexity and even contradictions. And what I'd like to do with you today is unpack some of those paradoxes, to examine this moment in Israel, this Israeli moment, and also this American Jewish moment. And how do we try, despite the confusion, despite the deep lack of Jewish unity, how do we try to find some clarity and some way forward as a people? So, from an Israeli perspective, the most powerful paradox of this moment is what we could call the tension between war and peace. Are we moving toward war? Are we moving toward peace? My sense is that we're moving toward both simultaneously. First, we are what I believe is in the final stages of this prolonged attempt to stop Iran from going nuclear. An attempt that has elicited tremendous courage, creativity from our strategic community, from the Mossad, from our Air Force. But it's clear that whatever it is that we've done to try to stop Iran is not enough. And the international community was never seriously committed to trying to stop Iran. Now, the question from the beginning was always the same, which is, what is your ultimate worst nightmare? Is it a nuclear Iran, or is it a preemptive strike to thwart a nuclear Iran? from the Israeli perspective, that we have made that clear from the beginning. And from the beginning, I mean going back to Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister. It was Rabin who first, in 1993, placed the Iranian threat at the center of Israel's strategic planning. And we forget this now, but one of the rationales that Rabin offered at the time for the ill-fated Oslo peace process was to try to neutralize the Palestinian conflict, and by extension the conflict with our Arab neighbors, and concentrate on what Rabin defined already then as the only real existential threat facing Israel, which is an eventual nuclear Iran. So since 1993, we have been committed, regardless of the party in power, to doing everything we can to thwart Iran. And if all else would fail, it has been a consensus within the Israeli political and strategic community that a preemptive strike is, however nightmarish war with Iran would be, that would nevertheless be preferable than to allowing Iran, God forbid, to go nuclear. We are now approaching that moment of decision. There's a growing tendency in the discourse, both in the United States and in Israel, to blame Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal for bringing us to this moment where Iran appears very close to crossing the nuclear threshold. Without getting into the politics, that is not at all my reading. My strong sense is that the original sin that brought us to this moment was the Iran deal of 2015. That deal allowed an open path for Iran to go nuclear. It did slow down the Iranian pace toward nuclearization, but at the same time, it also made it possible for Iran to see a very clear path toward nuclearization. And so the fact that the Biden administration has made it amply clear that the military option is not on the table. There is no credible military threat. All you have is this discredited 2015 deal that the administration is desperately trying to revive. And so my growing conclusion is that without a credible military threat to force Iran to compromise, the only alternative is an actual military threat. And that's part of the paradox of dealing with a bully regime like Iran's. If you don't project credible threat, in the end you'll find that you have no alternative but to actually rely on military power. The danger of a nuclear Iran is, first of all, the question mark that it places over the entire region. We will always be asking ourselves the question, will they or won't they use the weapon? Now, none of us has any clear answer to that. We don't know. Is this an insane apocalyptic regime that might be tempted to use the doomsday weapon to hasten the coming of the Mahdi, the Shiite Messiah? Or are they a rational regime that's capable of being deterred, to use the old Cold War language, by mutual assured destruction? But because we don't know the answer to that question, we will not take the risk. And the Begin Doctrine, which was implemented first with the destruction of Saddam Hussein's reactor in 1981, and then the destruction of Assad's reactor in 2007, remains the guiding strategic principle in this case as well. When in doubt, ensure that a genocidally minded enemy of the Jewish people does not have access to to the kind of weaponry that could, in principle, implement its program. The paradox here, though, for this moment in Israel is that even as what might be the worst war that Israel has fought since 1948, a war that will be fought, God forbid, against the home front, a war that will be fought through missiles aimed at our neighborhoods, a truly nightmarish war. At the same time, we are experiencing an outbreak of peace that we've never known before. The Abraham Accords, which never received the true recognition that they deserved, have changed the dynamic in the Middle East. The Arab siege against Israel, that the 70-year Arab war against Israel's legitimacy, which defined the Jewish reality that I grew up in. Israel is under permanent siege in the Middle East. Thanks to the Abraham Accords, the Arab siege is collapsing. The Abraham Accords not only widened the circle of Israel's formal peace agreements, but for the first time created a working model of genuine normalization between Israel and Arab countries. I've experienced this transformation personally. Right around the time of the Abraham Accords, I got an email from a think tank in Abu Dhabi inviting me to submit a paper and to join as a fellow. Since then, I've been in regular conversation with people all around the Arab world, in Baghdad, in Alexandria, in Morocco, in Kuwait. It's just this extraordinary expansion of my sense of place in the Middle East. I don't only live now in a small besieged country. I actually also live as part of a region. And this is a new and exhilarating experience for me. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. The book was translated into Arabic and offered for free downloading in Arabic. And the book is an attempt to explain Zionism and Jewish history, identity, to our Palestinian neighbors who are fed a daily diet of misinformation about the Jewish story in their media, schools, mosques. And this is really an attempt to start a conversation with Palestinians, and by extension, all Arabic speakers throughout the Middle East, about conflicting narratives. And the book was translated into Arabic and placed online for free downloading. And the book has been downloaded about 5,000 times so far in Arabic, and I invited readers to respond, and I've received hundreds of letters and emails from all around the Middle East, some of them very hostile, some of them challenging, and others deeply grateful for finally being able to read something about who we are, and that there was an Israeli who bothered to reach out to them to try to explain our story to them. And this really has created for me a whole new relationship with the region. And it has given me a sense that what was is no longer what will be. And so, on the one hand, the threat of a almost unthinkable conflict with Iran, unthinkable but perhaps unavoidable, and at the same time, an exhilarating sense of expansiveness, of possibility, of seeing Israel prevail, And the last point that I'll make here, which I think, for me at least, is crucial, is again, like I suspect many of you, one of my strong formative experiences was the post-Yom Kippur War atmosphere in which Israel was being relentlessly delegitimized around the world. And the Arab oil boycott was really creating the conditions for Israel's isolation. And helping to lead the Arab oil boycott almost half a century ago were the very Gulf countries that today are leading the process of normalization with Israel. And so this is what gives me hope. This is what keeps me as an Israeli from only looking at threat. Nevertheless, we live with threat. We absorb threat as part of our daily life. That's been a given in the Israeli experience. But now we have this added dimension of real peace together with very, very serious threat. But here's another paradox of our very complicated moment. Even as the Arab siege is collapsing, the siege against Israel in the West is rising through the BDS movement, through the delegitimization of Israel, through the assault on the Israeli story, on Zionism. And we're seeing this happen primarily in progressive spaces. And the irony is that this is beginning to penetrate into parts of American Jewry as well. Now, I think it's important for us to understand the nature of the BDS threat. Because in truth, BDS is not a threat to Israel. Not really. Certainly not a threat to the Israeli economy. In the 2 decades that BDS has been active and trying to stir up a boycott, an economic boycott of Israel, foreign investment in Israel has grown exponentially. Just in the last year, foreign investment in the Israeli high-tech sector has doubled. And so economically, as a weapon against Israel, BDS is a resounding failure. But BDS is a threat, and I would go so far as to almost say an existential threat. Not to us, but to you, to American Jewry, to the diaspora. And it's a threat because it undermines the hard-won achievement of American Jewry in being fully accepted unconditionally as part of American society. Now, when I was growing up, I remember a phenomenon that I would call the American Jewish whisper. And some of you may know what I'm talking about. I remember the Jewish adults in my life, when we were in a public non-Jewish space, if the word Jew was mentioned, they would lower their voice several octaves. And it didn't matter what the topic was, you didn't mention the word Jew without lowering your voice. In the last 2 generations, I noticed on trips that I would take back to the US, the gradual disappearance of the American Jewish whisper. Jews began to feel completely comfortable in the American public space. What BDS is doing is restoring conditionality to American Jewish life. You will be accepted in progressive spaces provided that you renounce Zionism, you renounce your attachment to Israel. And if you don't, you will be in a position again where if you speak about Israel or Zionism, you may find that your voice is starting to lower into a whisper. And I've experienced that on American campuses with Jewish students walking on the quad, and suddenly someone mentions the word Israel, and there's the American Jewish whisper again. This is a threat. I say that this is almost an existential threat, because this threatens the American Jewish sense of security. It threatens the long-term vitality of American Jewry, the ability of American Jews to be creative, to fully express themselves in the American non-Jewish public space. And this is the fight. And again, the irony here, the maddening paradox that we're living in, is on the one hand, the Arab siege is collapsing, and on the other hand, the anti-Israel siege is rising in the places we least expected it. In the American Jewish space, in the places where most American Jews live, in academia, in the media, in other liberal spaces. Looking for a moment at the internal state of the Jewish people. We are more divided today than we've ever been since the Holocaust. And the irony is that we are divided over Israel, which of course was once the great unifying factor in Jewish life. For my generation growing up, Israel was what brought Jews together, and now Israel is tearing American Jewry apart. Jews tend to be divided over two different forms of anguish over Israel. One part of the Jewish people is anguished, enraged really, over the fact that mere decades after the Shoah, we find ourselves once again being transformed into the world's criminals, into the symbol of the world's evil. But another part of the Jewish people is anguished over something very different. That Israel is being transformed into seemingly an open-ended occupier over another people. And how is it possible that we find ourselves in this situation, and that for so many Jews, so many Israelis, there isn't even this sense of anguish. There isn't even a sense of dissonance that we of all peoples would be ruling over another people. And so the anguish that this part of the Jewish people feels is, in a sense, anguish over the absence of more anguish within Israel over the occupation. I became a political centrist because I felt that it was only the center that was expansive enough to hold all of the contradictions of the Jewish people. Some of you know that my own political background is on the right, quite far on the right. When I was a teenager, I was a follower of Meir Kahane. It's not a secret. My first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, tells that story, the story of my attraction to Jewish extremism and my eventual disaffection. But a key part of that process for me, of moving out of the right, the far right, was the realization that a crucial source of Jewish power is the ability to maintain at least minimal unity within the Jewish people. My great trauma as an Israeli was making Aliyah in the summer of 1982, the beginning of the first Lebanon War. The Lebanon War was the first time in Israel's history, and thank God the only time, when war not only failed to unite us, war was always the moment when the Israeli people and world Jewry pulled most together. but it was actually war that was tearing us apart. And so coming into Israel, moving to Israel, at the moment that should have been an expression of our greatest unity, but was in fact the moment when we were tearing ourselves apart, really forced me to see the consequences of the extreme left-right divide, and to look for the center of gravity, which could hold our contradictions, could hold our contradictory poles ideologically, and could also try to make sense of all the contradictions of Jewish life in our time. Now that brings me to this moment in Israel, where we are now half a year into what is by far the strangest, most unlikely government, not only in Israel's history, but really an experimented government that I think is unique in the world today. There's no government anywhere that contains such radical contradictions as this Israeli government, ranging from the hard right, Yamina, to the hard left, Meretz. Who could have even imagined these two parties sitting together at the same table? Let alone Avigdor Lieberman, who for years has been running on an anti-Arab ticket, together with the Islamist Ra'am party. It's a surreal government. And yet I celebrate this government as an expression of the Israeli capacity to hold our contradictions together. And to my mind, this government is really a miracle. The fact that it was created at all, the fact that it's lasted this long. And so we're really looking at a phenomenon that I think both embodies the contradictions of this time, the uncertainty of this time with which I've been trying to unpack, and at the same time contains an extraordinary response to these contradictions that are threatening to tear us apart. We went through 3 maddening years of political deadlock, four unresolved elections. We were heading toward our 5th. There were fears that the political system would not hold, that its legitimacy was fraying. There was fear of political violence. And so this government, which calls itself a government of change, to my mind is really a government of national healing and even of rescue. But most profoundly, it is a government of contradiction, in the best sense of the word. A government that models what it's like for us to hold our contradictions together. And I'd like to focus on what I believe is the most intractable internal Israeli contradiction, which I see as potentially this government's greatest contribution to the long-term growth and maturation of Israeli society. And I'm speaking about the place of Arab Israelis within a Jewish state. 20+% of Israeli society are Arabs. Now, Zionism actually has a responsibility to 2 peoples. First of all, Zionism recreated the Jewish people from disparate, scattered communities back into a functioning, intimate people. And that was the great achievement of Zionism. But at the same time, Zionism created a second people, the Israelis. Now, of course, there's a great deal of overlap between the Israeli people and the Jewish people. But these 2 peoples are actually not quite the same. As we all know, there are many Jews who are not Israelis, who belong to the world Jewish people. And there are many Israelis who are not Jews. And Israel has yet to begin the process of asking the hard questions of who is an Israeli? What is an Israeli? You know, we have coalition crises periodically over defining who is a Jew. We need to start asking ourselves, who is an Israeli? And this government has put that question on the agenda. My reading of Israel's Declaration of Independence is that the founders envisioned the state that they were creating as essentially holding together two identities. First of all, Israel would be the state of every Jew, whether or not you were an Israeli citizen. And at the same time, Israel would be the state of all of its citizens, whether or not you were a Jew. This is the tension, the great contradiction, the paradox at the heart of Israeliness. And if we forfeit one identity or the other, if we forfeit Israel's Jewish identity or Israel's democratic identity, this will no longer be the modern state of Israel. And so we are fated to struggle between these two very difficult identities, made even more difficult by the fact that our non-Jewish minority is not simply an ordinary minority, but happens to be a minority that is part of a region that until recently was actively hostile to Israel's existence. And so there are layers of complexity here to unpack. Now, honestly, if you're asking me whether my ideal Arab political partner would be an Islamist party, my answer to you is certainly not. Even an apparently pragmatic Islamist party like Ra'am. But as we say in Hebrew, Zeh ma yesh, that's what there is. They had the courage to step forward, the first Arab party to say, we want to be part of a governing coalition. We are ready to put aside all of our substantial political differences for the sake of creating a coalition that will help advance the economic development of Arab Israelis and the integration of the Arab Israeli community into the mainstream. That is the greatest that's the greatest domestic challenge facing Israel. And that is what this government is directly addressing. And so my final comments that I'd like to leave you all with is that what seems to me required of Jews at this moment, whether Israelis or American Jews, is not giving up our ideological commitments, but placing those within the context of Klal Yisrael, of the wider Jewish people, of placing our sectarian Jewish commitments in a subservient position to the Jewish people in its totality, and paying attention to the complexities of this moment, which often scramble our ideological certainties, and they certainly did for me. In some sense, that's the story of my transition into becoming an Israeli. It was the realization that things were much more complicated than I thought they were. And again, to deal with complexity does not require giving up our ideals, quite the opposite. But it does require paying careful attention to nuance. And no less important, it requires paying attention to Jews with whom we disagree, to listen to them. Sometimes it's very painful, sometimes it's unbearable. And I've spent my career, really building my career, listening to Jews, listening to Israelis with whom I profoundly disagree, and struggling with all of the different ideas that create the Jewish people today. And what I've learned from the 40 years that I've lived in Israel is that the logic of what we call here the ingathering of the exiles, bringing Jews together from 100 different countries, literally, with every conceivable different idea about how the world works and should works, what a Jewish state means, and bringing all of these radically disparate kinds of Jews into one little overheated spot on the Mediterranean coast and say, okay, now figure it out. And the way to figure this out is by listening to each other. And I say that not only for the sake of democracy, for the sake of a democratic, pluralistic culture, which I obviously believe in deeply, but more deeply for the sake of keeping the Jewish people together. Because the only way that we're going to hold the Jewish people together is if we respect the contradictions that we're facing and the contradictions that make up Jewish identity today. Thank you again for this very touching honor. And I'm deeply grateful for your friendship, for your commitment to the Jewish people. And I wish I were there in person, and God willing, one of these days, Shabbat at the Kehilla. Be well and kol tuv.
The next song we're going to sing together is called B'siyata D'Shmaya, originally produced by Yerachmiel Began and the Miami Boys Choir. If I'm not mistaken, Ari sang it as a child back in the 90s. And this has been a family favorite, and again, one that I find tremendously inspiring. The theme of this song is B'siyata D'Shmaya, heavenly help. With the reality being that no matter where we turn, no matter where we could look here, we could look there, our help is only going to come from Hashem. That is the chorus of the song. B'siyata D'Shmaya, whatever we do, wherever we'll be, whenever we need help, we just turn to Hashem. And that, of course, is the theme of bitachon, of emunah, of faith and trust in Hashem, in knowing that we can rely on Hashem no matter what the situation. And how timely is this message for today as we continue to move, God willing, through this pandemic. And I pray that we all see the Siyata D'Shmaya in our life, and that we indeed experience the Siyata D'Shmaya, the heavenly help.
Hope arises again. B'siyata D'Shmaya, whatever I do, when I need Him to help me, He'll always come through. Never will I be alone. With His help, I can stand on my own. B'siyata D'Shmaya, whatever will be. All the world that I hope for is open to see. I need Him to show me the way. B'siyata D'Shmaya. Sometimes we feel the strength of our hand can bring us success, but we don't understand. It's not always the way it seems. Hashem alone provides our needs, stands behind every circumstance. No, it's not only by chance. It's not only by chance. No, it's not only by chance. B'siyata D'Shmaya, whatever I do, when I need Him to help me, He'll always come through. Never will I be alone. With His help, I can stand on my own. And B'siyata D'Shmaya, whatever will be, all the world that I hope for is open to see. Just ask Him to show me the way. B'siyata D'Shmaya. Ay, 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 ay. Prayer after prayer, tear after tear, begging for help, for heaven to hear. When Hashem is at our side, every door is open wide. Our only hope is to look to the sky, where He waits for our cry, where He waits for our cry. B'siyata d'ishmaya, whatever we do, when we need Him to help us, He'll always come through. Never will we be alone. With His help, we can stand on our own. B'siyata d'ishmaya, whatever will be, all the world that we hope for, hoping to see. We need Him to show us the way. B'siyata d'ishmaya, b'siyata d'ishmaya, whatever will be, all the world that we hope for is hoping to see. Just ask Him to show us the way. B'siyata d'ishmaya, b'siyata d'ishmaya, b'siyata d'ishmaya.
I'm so sorry that we cannot be together at this moment, but you're in Israel and I'm in Los Angeles. But my son Micah, who grew up in Westwood Kehilla and who made Aliyah almost 20 years ago, will present Westwood Kehilla's 2022 International Visionary Award to you. Micah is the founder of Open Door Media, whose short narrative films and feature-length documentaries have been featured on Netflix and have won awards at film festivals around the world. It's now my pleasure to introduce my son Micah.
Yossi, it's my pleasure to present to you the Westwood Kehilla's gift, commemorating today's events and recognizing your intellectual contributions to world Jewry. Your words are always a clarion call, like the shofar blast, to the Jewish people. I'm honored to present you this beautiful shofar. The plaque that accompanies it reads, International Visionary Award, Yossi Klein Halevi, Thinker, Seeker, Mensch.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all. And this is really beautiful. My very first shofar.
Thank you, Micah. A special thank you also to David Suissa, who so kindly participated in our program. And a thank you to Clark and Wendy Gross for being leaders of our Westwood Kehilla community for so many years and for allowing us to honor you. A very special thank you to Yossi Klein Halevi for permitting us to honor him and for his insightful keynote address on this Jewish moment. Thank you also to Rabbi Stewart and Ari Goldwag, whose music has added so much to this event. And thank you also to Micah Smith for filming Yossi Klein Halevi's remarks and being our conduit for delivering his well-deserved award. And thank you, Samson Sound and Lighting, for helping us bring this program to you. And finally, thank you to our viewers and our contributors. Your support means a lot to all of us at Westwood Kehilla. I know this has been a unique way to present a banquet, and Rabbi Stewart and I and the Westwood Kehilla and all of our members and friends give you a special thank you for your presence. We hope to see you often during 2022. Take care and good night.
The unity of the Jewish people is the theme of this song, the Achdut. The Torah tells us that we Jews are so connected to each other that not only are we obligated to love each other, even if something is done to you by someone else, another Jew, you're not allowed to take revenge. Lo tikum. Why not? It's the equivalent of, imagine you're in the kitchen and your right hand is slicing up a carrot and the knife, God forbid, cuts your left hand. Would you think that your left hand should pick up the knife and cut the right hand? It's nonsensical. It's ridiculous. We Jews are so connected at our core, at our neshama, at our soul, that we are meant to be one. And that's the theme of our song, Forever One. That's community. That's the Jewish community. That's us here at our beloved Westwood Kehilla, the Los Angeles community, the greater Jewish community throughout the world. And the song climaxes in the words that soon Mashiach will gather all the sparks, all the Jews from around the world, to make us again one with real unity with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu Meher V'Yameinu.
Times when we might drift apart and go our own separate ways. But the spark from above that we share is alive and ablaze. Soon Mashiach will gather each spark and shine away the darkness. He will gather us all together, and we shall ever be one. Forever one, we will go far. It's not I am, but who we are. We need just to reveal it. We need to try and feel it, and never are we alone. We have each other as our own. Nothing can divide us, for we are forever one. One more time, forever one. We will go far. It's not I am, but who we are. We need just to reveal it. We need to try and feel it, and never are we alone. We have each other as our own. Nothing can divide us, for we are, yes we are, forever one.
program. Brought to you, blah, 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 blah. I guess I don't have any words on the screen anymore.
Good Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. As I've told you many times, I'm bilingual. It's not a drasha for Shabbos?
And don't forget to drive home safely. Oh, you're already there. Good night.